The Association of MBAs webinar, Diffusion of Institutions. Good morning. This is part of the Global Connections MBA Refresh webinars launched to follow on from the success of our regular CPD certified MBA Refresher events. This series will allow more of our events across the globe to access knowledge of our accredited business schools academies. The MBA Refresher webinars are designed to take you back to school and bring you up to speed with one of the core topics covered by our MBA program in today's business environment. The Global Connections are a series of events and webinars organized by our Global Ambassadors. The Global Ambassadors are our network to accredited MBA alumni nominated by their business schools to serve their peers and promote the value of accredited MBA education. Today we are happy to take questions at the end of the session, so please do send them in as usual as we go along, and I will ask them at the end of the presentation. The slides and the audio will also be available at the end of the webinar in case you've missed everything. Today I'll hand you over to Anka Maldrilinou, an MBA student at Kingston University, and also the Association of MBA's Global Ambassador, who will introduce today's speaker. So Anka, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tim. As a Kingston MBA student, I'm proud that our university is committed to the Global Ambassador program, offering us direct access to a global MBA network and many worldwide events. As part of our commitment to this program, today I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker, Dr. Konstantinos Pitsakis, who is the senior lecturer in strategic management and has a specialization in academic entrepreneurship and institutional and diffusion theories. Dr. Pitsakis teaches one of the core modules of our MBA, and he was previously assistant professor of organization studies and fellow at the Center for Innovation Research at Tilburg University, where he taught strategy, entrepreneurship, and organization theory. Dr. Pitsakis obtained his PhD in management from Cass Business School. Today's webinar discusses new sociological accounts of how practices and processes spread and become taken for granted in markets and societies. Dr. Pitsakis will discuss how institutions emerge, the role of agents in forming them, and how they spread over time. Dr. Pitsakis will be happy to take questions at the end of the session, as you mentioned, Tim. Also, the slides and his contact details will be available after the webinar in case you've missed something. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Pitsakis now.
Okay, thank you, Anka and team. Welcome, everybody. Okay, my background is my PhD was on organization theory. That was my first academic job in Holland. So this is my favorite topic, although I do teach mainstream strategy stuff, like, Porter's 5 forces, capabilities, dynamic capabilities analysis, and so forth. Now, the problem with all these economic theories and strategy theories and mainstream strategy and economic theories is, as you know, there are so many assumptions that actually don't hold when they do any kind of analysis. So, for instance, in economics, we assume that there is a rational actor who does things, and we don't quite take into account the way institutions affect people's decision-making process. So, this is what I want to discuss in this lecture, which is going to be very introductory, I have to say. But I do give examples of how practices and processes diffuse and become institutionalized, which means they become taken for granted in societies. When I speak about institutions, you can think of everything from the church, the United Nations, this kind of major established institutions, but also smaller things such as the handshake or anything that in the business world is taken for granted. Those are pretty contemporary theories. They started basically in the late 1970s when I was born, and but most of the things that we know today have come in the past 10, 15 years. Although there was Douglas North from the USA who got a Nobel in economics, he's an institutional economists, and he deals with some of those issues. Okay, so why is this webinar useful? It is useful because you can think of institutions that are helpful to organizations. For instance, I will tell you now that Coca-Cola is an institution. Coca-Cola is an institution. It is a product. It is a company that sells the products. But it is an institution because people take it for granted that when they eat, they're going to drink this kind of soft drink and not something else. So they go to the supermarket, the groceries, and they just buy it without pretty much thinking, the consequences or its price or all these things. So how do products like this or business processes like business structures diffuse over time? This is what I wanted to discuss today, and that's why it is useful for people who are interested in business. To be honest, I've taken most of the material I'm going to speak about from this book by Dick Scott, who is an emeritus professor at Stanford University today. His book is on Institutions and Organizations, Ideas and Interests from Sage Publications. I do recommend buying this book if you're interested in institutional theory. And I'm basically going to look at chapters 5 and 6. So it will be pretty easy. I mean, I have my own examples and things I want to discuss, but it will be easy to follow me or to refresh your minds if you buy the book and look at those two chapters. Chapter 5 is more about creating institutions. So where do institutions come from, and at what levels of analysis do we observe institutional creation? So those are the two things with which Chapter 5 deals. Let's look at creating institutions. How do institutions, so how do things that are taken for granted come about in the business world? Obviously, institutions emerge as brand new. They challenge other institutions. They borrow from other institutions, or they replace older institutions. So it's something that keeps going all the time. Let's look at some of the explanations that we see in the book of Dick Scott. The first thing is the first point here is that institutions emerge naturally. So there is a constant social interaction that changes the perceptions and beliefs about what is appropriate gradually. And it's not a single point in all this process that is a defining moment. So it's a very slow, gradual process of institutional creation, of the emergence of institutions. So think about the languages we use today, the English language, the Dutch language, the Greek language, whatever you want. It has gone through many, many years of evolution, isn't it? And of course, there may have been some major events that pushed forward language, but it's a process that evolves over time very slowly. Or think about the codification of the law and punishment when it comes to how people behave and what is acceptable in our societies. So it's obvious that some things evolve over time, and you can actually say that there is an element, a small element of luck in all this process, in the sense that there have been alternatives that have been rejected, and there have been alternatives that have been accepted as appropriate ways of speaking or as appropriate ways of shopping or buying stuff, isn't it? Or, like I said, of law and punishment. Okay, so the second point is demand and supply explanations. Here we have a process whereby we have a problem that we have to fix, and we're looking for solutions. If the problem is brand new somehow, then we're looking at a solution that is pretty novel. and that's how new institutions come about. But a lot of the times we're looking, we have situations where we have problems and we want to find some sort of ad hoc solution, or we may not even develop a new institution to solve a problem, and we just, we may have a very temporary solution. Think about.
Sorry to interrupt you, Doctor. I'm just noting that the slides aren't moving forward. Can you confirm that they're being displayed and it's moving forward from the first slide?
Yes, they are. Yeah.
I can't see that it's being displayed on the webinar. Could you just possibly refresh that? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah. Now, you see anything?
I can't. If the rest of the users could let me know whether they're seeing the screens or not, that would be great. I'm just going to mute this again, so I'll chip in if I need to say anything. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay. So I was saying, I was discussing, I'm actually on slide 7 now, and I was discussing demand and supply explanations. So the idea that we have a problem, we need to find a solution for that. So think about, again, religion. People need to believe in something. So we need to have a place where we worship God, and that is a very permanent, it's a permanent problem that we have to find a solution that is permanent. So that's how we build churches as new institutions with rules, with buildings, with all these things that we know. Other times we find ad hoc solutions, like I said. I'm moving on to slide 8, where I think about, I'm mentioning here demand and supply explanations.
Hi, I'm sorry to interject here again. I just had some feedback from actually everybody. The slides aren't moving on at all. I don't know whether you can make sure that you've made your screen into the presenter and shown your screen. It's not being displayed here. I'm really sorry to interrupt you.
Okay, 1 minute. Now?
Perfect, much better. So if you make that full screen.
Okay.
Okay, everybody, can I just have some feedback? Can you see the new slides? Okay, everything seems to be fine now. I'll dip back out. Thank you very much.
Okay, perfect. I'm sorry, guys. I'm sorry to everybody. So this is a slide I was using about naturalistic accounts of institutional emergence, and this is a slide I was discussing about demand and supply explanations, where we can have ad hoc solutions or brand new permanent institutions. There is also demand and supply explanations. Here, I will come to this later on. We're going to discuss about how practices or processes diffuse, so institutions diffuse within industries, and I will discuss a little bit the idea that we have an institutional void. So we have a void. There's something we need to cover with some sort of institution, and there are certain people who play an important role in these things. For instance, industrial associations who promote the interests of the members of the association, or market gurus, smart people, out there, or magazines, all these people who have an influence on what is the best way to move forward. So again, think about a human handshake, which was invented a long time ago, so that people could greet each other. There was an institutional void. What do we regard as the best way to greet each other in the West? You cannot have people greeting each other in many different ways, right? Because it would be very difficult to sustain somehow, isn't it? So we need to have a unified solution to that. Or think about a company that is looking for a structural reorganization. Like I said before, where do you look for advice, for suggestions? I will come back to this, and I'll show you how certain actors, like the associations or media gurus, like I said, journals and magazines, offer advice for money. Yeah, so they get paid to give you advice on what is the best structure for the organization, how best to do foreign direct investments, and all these things. So demand and supply explanations. There is a certain amount of people who want some sort of advice, and there's others who offer it. If that is the case, then the people who are the agents who offer advice specifically. When we think about agency, when we think about the idea of agent, a typical agent is somebody whose interests are not the interests of the principal. You may have heard this story before. A typical agent is a chief executive of a he gets paid by the organization to do the things that the organization, the owners want them to do, but at some point they may start doing what they want, because they think it is the appropriate action. So these agents have and they have a lot of power, and that is very important. You can think of, like I said, chief executives who have their own interests, their own education, their own agendas. You can think about politicians and rich people from who form institutions for their own purposes. You can think about the power of the intellectuals, so professors, authors, journalists, who of course write history and suggest things that favors and glorifies their actions. So there is certain you can think about lobbyists, people who lobby, lobbying group. So all these people act as agents, and they affect the process of what is acceptable in a society, what is taken for granted in a society. Now this is a very interesting literature, and you can read more if you want. I have some references here, and at the end of the slides. The concept we're looking at here is entrepreneurship, institutional work. So the idea that there are some entrepreneurs, there's some people, who do purposeful, directed action towards creating, maintaining, or disrupting institutions. And that is based on their emotions, sensitivities, prior experience or knowledge, or their commercial interests and commercial expectations. So here the point is that who are the people who lobby, who are the people who want to break the institutions that we have, whether it comes to doing trade, doing business, or the kind of products we consume, for instance, genetically modified products. There are certain people who are pushing for those things, aren't they? And we need to know them. A little bit more about agents as different categories of agents and how they matter, how they're important. Of course, the nation state, so the rules and regulations of the government, the professions, that is a group of individuals that represent some sort of body. So accountants, craftsmen, and so forth. There could be unions in that respect. Who represent certain individuals. It's associations, industrial associations. So the accounting association, the MBA association, if you want, the students associations, all sorts of things. The elites, the wealthy, journalists, artists, athletes. All these people have something special in their hands. They're well known. A lot of the times they're sort of celebrities, and they affect the way institutions come about, isn't it? So think about the endorsement by celebrities, by elites. They have a very powerful voice that affects people perceive as different, perceive as being a good product or a good process within our society, within organizations. Think about social movements, so non-governmental organizations, or political parties, the conservatives, the liberals, or even the terrorists, who there's a lot of discussion nowadays about how they, they instill fear among people and affect their psychology, their behavior. And then think about marginal players. It could be any kind of those who may be in the right position at the right time, and thus exercise some sort of power. I will come to this in a minute, but think about whether institutions that are designed by agents can actually work or fail. there is a certain amount of unintended consequences. So you say, I'm going to try to push for this kind of legislation because it allows me to do business in a better way, but this might have a lot of unintended consequences, and that will probably come back and hurt you. Or think about, I'll come back to these fad and fashion influences. So the idea, there is some people who spread ideas all over the industry, all over society, but then this is not going to last for a long period of time. So fads and fashions collapse within a short period of time. And that is because agents design institutions with a very short time perspective. A lot of these people who think about demand and supply conditions that I said before, a lot of those people basically look for profit. Okay, so when you think about total quality management, it was propagated, it was pushed for by magazines, and think about The Economist, the Time magazine, anything you want. There was not proper research behind TQM to see whether they actually, organizations gain something out of it. In fact, there have been researches now in the past 2 or 3 years that show that 70% of businesses try the TQM, and when you ask them, have you seen any improvement in your business over the past over the years that you have been using, have been implementing TQM, they would say none. It's only about 10 or 15% who say they saw some sort of improvement. So those are ideas about what is the appropriate way of organizing businesses, of running an organization that were pushed for by wealthy individuals, or, like I said, certain kind of players like magazines that were looking for money, that were looking for profit, but actually didn't quite look at whether this is something beneficial for organizations. Okay, so that is another problem of how agents affect institutional creation. And then there's constant evolution of fields, and you cannot have a single institution that is accepted throughout. So it's sometimes what agents try to develop have very negative consequences. And of course, you can think of very few institutional heroes, people who did a lot of reforms that lasted for centuries, such as Luther, and many other institutional designers who failed. So people who try to instill the fascist sort of way of running a society, like Mussolini or Hitler. They did have ideologies, they did want to construct societies the way they wanted, but it didn't work out, right? For many reasons. So there's few times do institutional attempts at institutional creation succeed, and most of the times they don't succeed for the reasons that we discussed. Okay, so one exercise I gave to students all the time when I taught this class, I still teach it, is to think about any kind of institution. And like I said, you can think of things that affect businesses indirectly, or you can think about things that, products or processes within organizations that affect the organization, any organization, directly. So how were, how were institutions created? Naturally, by demand and supply, and who were the major agents, and were they successful or not? How did this whole process, evolve over time? So here I have a few examples of practices and processes that took place over the past couple of centuries. So a major institution is, of course, universal suffrage, which replaced aristocracy as a way of running countries, and the core agents were the feminists. It was a huge movement starting from the 1890s onwards to 1920s and 30s, and it was a very successful movement. Now that says a lot about our society, isn't it? And even about the way consumers, individuals, behave in a market where firms operate. Or think about the 20th century peasantry, which effectively replaced feudalism, which was the main institution throughout the medieval times. Peasants had a revolution, a constant revolution over many centuries across many countries, and it was again a big success. The third example is a multidivisional form, which, as you probably know, is an organizational structure or form that became very prevalent in the 1970s and throughout the 1980s. Excuse me. Where basically you had large organizations, large corporations, structuring their businesses, their strategic business units in many different sort of divisions, and that was in contrast to the prior single divisions, where firms were very much specialized and they did one or two things, and that was it. We're coming back to this old institution of single divisions nowadays, and you may have heard organizations who divest some of their businesses for that reason, because they cannot manage many sort of divisions within the same organization. So that was an institution that has changed over time. I mentioned before the language as an institution. It has replaced sounds and noises that existed for many centuries before our society agreed on what is a good way of communicating somehow. Or think about two more business examples, the TQM, which was promoted, as I said, by market gurus, and it has been pretty much a failure. Okay, we haven't got any strong evidence that TQM was beneficial for organizations. Or think about ISO 9000 as a certificate of quality. There was nothing before that, so there was no institution before that. It was something that was created pretty much out of the blue, and it was created by an association. As you probably know, the ISO is an association. It's a for-profit organization that does this thing. But if you think about it, there was a need to codify quality in organizations. So this was more like a supply and demand process of institution creation. It's an ongoing process, but I think pretty much it is a success. So so there you go. Now you see some examples of how institutions emerge and what do they replace, who are the core agents, and whether they have been a success or a failure. Levels of analysis. Where do we observe, if we can codify this process, where do we observe institutional creation? Who does it? If you look at it, from more macro perspective, who does it? Institutions. First of all, institutions move from one country to the other. Okay, so stock exchange. There's studies that discuss stock exchange diffusion. Why do countries have stock exchanges today? That was something that started from the British Empire, from the United States, but then you have every single country today having some sort of stock exchange, or the idea of having a highly educated individuals, or the idea that people have to go to the school until they're 17, 18. That didn't exist in the past. So there's a lot of processes where institutions evolve from one country to the other, and they're being, copied or mimicked by other countries. There are societal level studies, so think about how property rights in England and Holland evolved over time. This is Douglas North study, is the American guy who got the Nobel Prize in economics that I said before. And as you know, one of the reasons why England and Holland and the West are so wealthy today has to do precisely with the fact that we protect our property rights, isn't it? So you cannot have a functioning economy if you don't have property rights firmly established. Think about field level studies. So there is sometimes institutions emerge in specific fields. In this case, I have the examples of museums. In the beginning, museums were designed by professionals, so people who did the excavations, artists, people who were genuinely interested in art and exhibiting art in museums. But then it was shaped by elites, so there was a huge amount of people who want to make money out of this, and that's why we have so many museums today and so many people who try to make money out of it. They charge you to go in, and they charge you to buy art, basically, to watch and see artifacts in museums. So that is something that happened very specifically in this particular field. Let's move on to population level studies. Population is a group of organizations that do the same things. Here is what I said before about the influence of associations of media gurus. So it's people specifically focusing on a specific industry somehow. So the mobile industry, the car manufacturing industry. There's people who have expertise in these sort of industries, and they shape what is appropriate practices or processes and what is taken for granted in certain industries. Think about organizational level studies where, like I said before, large American organizations try to experiment with a multidivisional form, and from that on started spreading to other countries. Or think about why individuals choose a certain course of action based on their own interests and the idea of doing it alone or cooperating with others. So sort of game theory perspectives. We all think about whether we should be going with the flow, isn't it, or do our own things. So you can see institutions evolving and emerging in all these different levels of analysis. Okay, let's move on quickly to Scott's chapter 6, which basically discusses, goes beyond how institutions are created and the role of agents, and it looks more at how they diffuse, the actual processes with which institutions diffuse across organizations. So I want us to look at the idea of institutionalization and then the maintenance and diffusion of institutions. Okay, institutionalization is both a process and a property, an outcome, which basically explains how things are eventually taken for granted. Okay, it's very simple. Why do we take it for granted that Coca-Cola is the #1 soft drink? Why do we take it for granted that if we are going to buy weapons, if we're a country that wants to buy weapons, they're going to buy American weapons and not Russian weapons? Yeah, so those are the questions institutionalization as a process tries to explain. Okay. So again, a little bit of a definition here. It's a process and outcome of taking for grantedness, like I said. Okay, so here's a few examples. #1, institutionalization takes place because of increasing returns. So actors are reluctant to consider alternatives because of high setup costs, learning effects, coordination effects, compatibility problems, isn't it? And adaptive expectations. So, like I said before, we all know that the Russians, the Soviets, had perhaps even better weapons than the Americans, yet everybody was buying weapons from the Americans. Why? Because there was a lot of learning effects. So if you start having American weapons, it's hard to change to Russian weapons. There's a compatibility problem. There's high setup costs. And that's why, the Soviets, there's also political reasons, of course, but the idea is that there's a lot of processes behind the decision not to go from U.S. to Russian weapons or to look at other alternatives. If you think about it, institutional theory is a theory of non-action. Okay, so it is not an action-based theory. When we think about strategy, we think about, as I said in the beginning, or economics, we think about smart individuals, chief executives who act, who take decisions, they look at all the facts, and they take the decision. Institutional theory is a theory of non-action. So it's the idea that we do things without thinking. You don't quite have to go through this list of problems to say that I'm not going to buy Russian weapons. You just go straight to U.S. weapons. Countries go straight to U.S. weapons because they know deep inside them that these problems exist. Okay, so it's a taken for granted process. You want weapons, you go to the U.S. right? Okay, think about the problem of Windows, Windows selling so well, and other operation softwares like Linux or Mac not selling so good. It's again the same problem, isn't it? Linux is a very efficient program, but it hasn't been adopted so much compared to Windows. Then the core issue with institutions is the fact that they have values and meanings for people who observe them. Okay, so the second way that institutionalization takes place is based on increasing commitments. So the more and higher the values of the institution that we observe represents, the more committed people will be towards it. So think about the handshake versus the high five. The handshake is about respect, interest, care, tradition, isn't it? Whereas the high five, the only value it represents is to have fun, basically. That's why the handshake is so prevalent, and high five is used by young people, you know, when they just want to have some fun. Or church wedding versus civil ceremony. The wedding is about respect, tradition, luck, wishing a good start. It's all these things, isn't it? Whereas the civil ceremony is about, you know, quietness and respect. You can think of a few more values they represent, but the core idea is that the proper wedding in a church carries more value, more meaning for people throughout the centuries, isn't it? So increasing commitments. People are committed to things that have a higher value for them. And the third process is based on increasing objectification. So it's the idea that we build consensus over time. This is the appropriate course of action. This is how it happens. Most of the times we have some sort of technological change, market forces, ideas, you know, coming about, legislation, whatever it is, some sort of innovation, some sort of product, whatever it is, which gradually over time becomes a habit. But you know, a habit could be a fad or a fashion, so it could collapse. So there's got to be a certain degree of objectification, discussion. Is this suitable? Is this effective? Is the right way to move forward? And there's a consensus built around what is a good institution or not, and that's how it becomes a permanent institution. So think about the smartphones. You know, there's been a lot of designs of smartphones, of cell phones in the past. But you know, they just come and go all the time. So the idea that a smartphone is taken for granted today, and that people don't look for other alternatives, there has been a certain discourse behind that, isn't it? So people have agreed that it is effective, it is suitable, and so it is objectified as the best institution as far as communication, contemporary communication is concerned. Maintenance of institutions. I don't have to say much here. Just refer to the experiment by Louis Zucker in 1977. You may have heard of the experiment, the original autokinetic experiment that was done by Sheriff in 1935. The idea is that people, you know, move into a room and there is a light bulb, you know, that is flashing, and people are prompted to describe how much they think the light was actually moving as they were coming into the room. The room is dark, and the light, you know, goes on every few minutes. Now, in this case, Lynn Zucker expanded this experiment and tried to do what? She put in individuals, in this case employees of an organization, who were then followed by other colleagues, people who work with them in the same organization, and then by the lights operator, or the electrician somehow of the organization, who was the expert in this case. And they were trying to see whether the subject's opinion of how much the light moves was affected by the expertise and the embeddedness somehow of the other actors in the organization. Okay, so what they observed is that individuals are influenced by what others say about things that happen, but they're more influenced about people within the organization who have more authority somehow, and especially from the electrician. So you can see here that people thought the movement in inches was much higher because the electrician said so, and much less because some of their colleagues said so. So they were listening to what the experts were saying, and that is an indication of how we take agents, strong agents, as big parts of what is the appropriate action somehow. The study went a little bit further and tried to explain if that would be the case when we repeated the experiment. So we would have people, going through the same process many, many times. And as you can see, the influence decreases somehow. So people start thinking about what they think is happening when they do the same things many times. But in the initial phase, we're very much influenced by people who have authority, by strong agents, and less so by people who are similar to us, or even by our own actions, our own observations, isn't it? And so that says a lot about how values infused within certain individuals, certain actors, and how they influence the way we think about what is acceptable course of action, what is taken for granted. So much so that people are happy to dismiss what they saw because somebody else told them it is wrong. Okay, so let me close this presentation by looking at the diffusion of institutions, which was actually the core title of the presentation. But I wanted to discuss a little bit how institutions are created and maintained before that. So institutions diffuse based on regulatory processes, normative processes, cognitive processes, and demand and supply, which is a fad and fashions idea that I've been in a minute now. So regulatory processes, the necessary elements are we have clear demands for some sort of a problem to solve a problem. We need effective surveillance and significant sanctions. So this is a more coercive approach. And think about how the certain institutions from the West, for instance, the way the French police was organized, or the British Navy was organized, or how the American education was organized, or how German medical universities were organized, were basically imitated by the Japanese around 1885. As you probably know, Japan was a pretty poor country back then, and they sent emissaries all over Europe and in the West to see how were these countries organized and were so successful. And basically what they did was they had clear demands, clear ideas about what they wanted to figure out. They copied what the others did, and they were enforced. Those institutions, those Western European institutions, were enforced in a very strict, very tough way. So that's why Japan is such a successful country today. The second process is of the diffusion of institutions and normative processes. Okay, so think about the underlying reasons why things, why institutions diffuse. Networks and connections. The role of the top management teams that I said before. You may have heard the idea of board interlocks, the idea that people who sit on the board of one organization sit on the boards, are board members in many other organizations. So there is a lot of exchange of ideas and opinions there, and they influence each other somehow. Think about the influence of the unions. For instance, in Germany, unions co-decide the production process of major organizations, and that is a cultural issue, isn't it? It's a norm that unions participate in the management of organizations. Or think about the role of professional trade associations that I mentioned before. Those are norms that have evolved over time, aren't they? Okay, the third process is the cultural, cognitive sort of processes, and here you may have seen the book by Bergen and Luckman, The Social Construction of Reality. Is a book from the 1960s, which basically discusses how people influence each other when they belong to a similar category. So obviously, if you are a small company manufacturing business-to-consumer sort of products, it's unlikely you're going to try to imitate somebody who is, it's unlikely you're going to imitate a major organization that is listed in the stock exchange and produces business-to-business products. Okay, so there is a certain degree of mimicry here based on similarity. Okay, so that is a cultural sort of cognitive process. in the diffusion of institutions. The final thing is demand and supply conditions. Like I said before, we have actor A who is asking for some sort of recipes for success, and actor B provide solutions. Fads are processes whereby the diffusion is determined by organizations B within the industry A, and fashion is when diffusion is determined by organizations B outside the industry of A. So let me explain this a little bit. Fashion is when we take advice, as I said before, from media gurus, from people who have published smart books, from magazine publishers, and what they do is they give advice without perhaps knowing what is happening within the industry. Okay, and that is very problematic because they do it to make money. They sell ideas to make money, and that's why a lot of the times the institutions don't turn out to be useful to organizations within the industry. When we think about fads, what happens is people within the industry, so it could be the best organization, the most profitable organization, the largest organization, or the older organization in the industry, is trying to enforce its own rules, its own institutions, its own way of doing business on other organizations. And there is the compatibility problem I said before. If you're not similar with others, you shouldn't be following their example. Okay, so if you look at the trajectory of fads and fashions, most of the times you have a massive increase that is followed by a decrease in adoption. Okay, so like I said, TQM, a massive increase in adoption, but usually, within a couple of years it collapses. So people abandon using TQM. Let's think about carriers of institutions in our society. So how do we observe? Where do we observe institutions in our society? And that is my final slide. We have symbolic systems. You may have heard Marshall McLuhan's, the Canadian author's quote, "The medium is a message." Okay, so when you think about how things are framed and how things are, it's not so much the message that is sent to people, but it's the medium that transmits the message. Okay, so a lot of the times the idea of what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what is a good institution, what is an appropriate course of action, is transmitted by symbolic sort of systems, and it's not so much the substance of the institution, but the system that conveys the necessity of the institution. Yeah. Think about relational systems. So the idea that institutions and ideas travel, as I said before, among individuals who are connected to each other, have similar interests, and they sort of help each other. Or think about within organizations, think about routines. It's an institution to say that nobody comes late to work. Okay? Or it is an institution to say that everybody is allowed to come to work whenever they want. Or it is an institution to say that it's a routine. It's an institution to say that people are happy, people are okay to work from home whenever they want to, because we think they will still achieve their targets. Or think about specific artifacts, so objects, machines, technologies, tools that comply with mandatory specifications as to why institutions should be diffused. So there's so many different ways where we can see, we can observe institutions within our societies. So that was all I had to say. If you read the book of Dick Scott about how institutions emerge, how they are maintained, and how they diffuse, the core idea is we need three different things. One is the three pillars, as he calls them. One is regulation, the other is norms, and the third is culture and cognitive sort of processes. And that is, those three pillars basically explain why certain processes or products or practices are more successful than others in our society. And that has a lot of implications, commercial implications about, exploiting opportunities out there, or commercial opportunities, or organizing businesses in a most effective way. if you wish. Okay, so I have a few references here. Most of those I mentioned before, so Batilana and Lawrence about institutional entrepreneurship, institutional work, theories of diffusion, and some classic papers and books, book chapters on the diffusion of institutions. That's it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for the presentation. I'm sorry all about the problems with the sound. I'm glad that we got that sorted. I'm going to go straight into the Q&A session because we've got a tiny bit of time left. First question is, why did Japanese manufacturing succeed from TQM? The US invented it, but then rejected it, and so Denning took it to Japan.
I think that's a good question. I think a lot of it has to do with the sort of cognitive processes within those societies. So if you think about the Japanese, they're much more disciplined people somehow. You've all heard this story of them striking. When they want to strike, they just strike with a bandage on their hands saying we're striking, but effectively they keep working. So all this sort of disciplined way of organizing their businesses was much different from the Americans, who are more action-oriented. The Americans look more in the short term compared to the Japanese, who have much long-term perspective compared to the Americans. So it was a whole process. It was an institution that actually didn't fit the needs of the Americans somehow. I think that's the main reason. It was tried. It was copied because the Americans wanted to succeed and overtake the Japanese, but it wasn't right for them for cultural reasons.
Great, thank you very much. The next question is, highly topical is the institution of the MBA as a qualification. Public opinion has gone down recently, possibly because the MBA's association with business, banking and consulting, which has fallen out of favour. Please can you comment more generally on the recent history and the future of business schools?
Yeah, interesting question. I'm probably not the right person to comment on this, but you know, I hope you have seen some of those elements in my presentation. So unfortunately, we have a certain amount of agents, institutional entrepreneurs who are involved in this process, and a lot of these people are what I said before, the elites. So we do have a lot of powerful organizations and individuals who are involved in basically what is the appropriate way of teaching business or doing research on business, and that is problematic. So if you want my own opinion, there is a conflict of interest when you have academic chairs, academic positions being sponsored by organizations, because those academics who do research for those particular organizations, the big organizations who sponsor those chairs. That is a problem. So a lot of that has to do with the decrease in government funding towards universities, towards business schools. Now, business schools are the most profitable parts of any university, and as you may know, business schools a lot of the time subsidize other schools within the university. For instance, the Department of Sociology, the Department of Psychology, for very obvious reasons. But I think we need to rethink about what are the purposes of this in today's world. I think we're in degrees. I'm personally very much fascinated and excited about the kind of research we do on CSR, corporate social responsibility, sustainable sort of. But that is not enough because the whole, I think the institution of the MBAs, institution of universities need a lot of rethinking, and in that respect, I would say we should go back a few years in the past, perhaps, when it comes to sources of funding, standardization, and the priorities we have when it comes to you know, what do we teach and what things do we do research? What are the things that matter for our societies?
Great, thank you very much for answering that one. I'm going to quickly run on to the next question. which is institutions are organic, continuous, incremental, and not therefore episodic. Where does radical innovation fit in?
Can you repeat that, Tim?
Yep, not a problem. Institutions are organic, continuous, incremental, and therefore not episodic. Where does radical innovation fit in?
Okay. I said something about this when I spoke about the process of objectification. So I don't agree with that institutions are always incremental. So if you think about, perhaps it's more difficult to find institutions in the business world that are so and came about very quickly through some sort of a revolution. But if you think about what Luther did, of course, it took some time, but changed the whole idea of what is religion in the north of Europe. So you can have new institutions emerge from innovation, from brand new ideas. The problem is that you spend a lot of time in building, about on what is the appropriate way of doing business. So if you think about products as innovations, or even as innovations, you need to back particular innovation, to back them up with some sort of lobbying, some sort of arguing, some sort of argumentation to build consensus that is the best way to move forward. And I mentioned before the example of smartphones. Why are smartphones the way they are? Why is this sort of the touchscreen technology, whatever it is? Why is it so appropriate? Why was it preferred by people? That is one example. There has been a lot of development behind that, and it was a successful radical innovation that became an institution. But there's other institutions based on innovation, such as the genetically modified products, which haven't been successful, and that is because the objectification process wasn't very successful. Like I said, there has been a lot of debate. There's a lot of negative mobilization against genetically modified products, and that's why it didn't succeed. So, like I said, I don't agree with institutions are always incremental. They can be very radical and revolutionary, the way they emerge, and also the way they diffuse. But a lot of what needs to be done has to do with the process of objectification. So, just another quick example. I remember when the mobile phones came about in the 1990s, 1995. A lot of organizations built cell phones, but they couldn't sell them. Why? Because people didn't believe in them, and they didn't have the proper distribution channels. So you say have a very smart, useful, amazing product, but we were used to making phone calls with those plastic landline machines, and then we couldn't actually see, we couldn't listen to your arguments. There was not much arguments about what the purpose of mobile phones were in the first place. And I think that's the objectification problem is very important in that respect.
Great. Many thanks all for your questions, and thank you very much again to the doctor for today's presentation. It's been thoroughly enjoyable, and thank you very much for the questions that have come in. Again, all the slides and the audio are available after the webinar, and in case you've missed anything, and I'll make sure that the first 7 slides that we didn't manage to get through are sent to everybody so we can see the presentation. Just finally, I just want to bring your attention to the up-and-coming webinars that we have next. Firstly, the Global Connections webinar, which is Creativity plus Innovation equals Choice. That's on Thursday, the 26th of September from 11 a.m. till 12. And also, finally, we've got our next refresher event at Cass Business School on the 9th of October. For more details and to book, please go to www.mbaworld.com. And again, thank you for joining us on this webinar. Many thanks to Kingston's Global Ambassador, Anka, for setting up this webinar. And thanks again to our speaker, and goodbye.